Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Matthew Hughes, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. It is our great pleasure to have you with us today for this conversation on innovating cooperation, COVID, Germany, and the US. The International Relations Council, as you may know, strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We do have a number of other upcoming digital events that may be of interest to you. Tomorrow, please join us for an international career conversation with former US Ambassador to Portugal and IRC member Alan Katz. Tuesday is the launch of the IRC's new film club, where we will be discussing the movie Roma. On Wednesday, join us for a conversation with historian Michael Kimmage and Spy Museum curator Vince Houghton on what happened to the idea of the West in American foreign policy. And then stay around for an introduction to the Amharic language and Ethiopian culture. There are a few other ways to get involved with the IRC. Do check out our weekly newsletter for the latest updates on events and consider joining the IRC as a member. Besides supporting our work, your membership gives you the chance to plug in to the international community in Kansas City. We'd like to thank our program partners for today's discussion. The World Trade Center in Kansas City connects the Kansas City regional business community to the people, companies, data, and government agencies that make up the fabric of global commerce. And the Bertelsmann Foundation is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C., with a transatlantic perspective on global challenges. We invite you to visit their websites for more information. And now to the topic at hand. While devastating in many respects, the COVID pandemic has encouraged innovative local solutions and opportunities for international cooperation in numerous sectors. We are privileged to welcome Matthias Klause, head of the economic section of the German embassy in Washington, who will offer insight into the German response to COVID and the outlook for transatlantic relations and trade during these uncertain times. Before coming to Washington, Mr. Klause was head of the Office of Minister of State, Dr. Maria Böhmer, in the German Foreign Ministry. His work covered external economic policy and sustainable development issues, cultural relations and education policy, Germany's involvement with the United Nations, and global policies. He has served at German missions in Washington, London, and Warsaw. Mr. Klause will offer some opening remarks, and then we'll move into a question and answer period. You are most welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Mr. Klause, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think we may be on mute. 1 second.
Okay, now I think
got you. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much anyway for the invitation to speak to you. Thank you very much to Matthew, to the International Relations Council, and also to Emily, representing the Bertelsmann Foundation, who were really essential to get this meeting together. Originally, I would have liked to be there in person, but obviously we had to change these plans, but this is just a postponed visit. I'm looking forward to that, but at the moment, I'm really looking forward to communicating with you through Zoom. I'll start right away with a few remarks. The topic basically is COVID, Germany, and the US and transatlantic cooperation. So I'll start with a few remarks concerning COVID. The virus has left a devastating human and economic toll in its wake as it has spread around the globe. And we are actually still in the middle of a worldwide public health crisis. The first and major aim of governments and each of us basically was to prevent a catastrophe in our healthcare systems. And we did that by slowing down the spreading and expanding the capacities and also protecting ourselves. So as a consequence, some sectors of our economy and public life have been effectively closed since mid-March, and some people have put their lives and livelihoods on the hold, making enormous sacrifices to protect not just their own health and that of their loved ones, but also their neighbors and broader community. So basically, the public health crisis has led to an economic and social crisis. The scope and speed of this downturn are without modern precedent, significantly worse than the recession we have known so far. The latest IMF figures predict a global loss of 5% GDP for the whole year of global growth. That's a severe decline for everybody in economic activity and employment. Germany, Europe, and the US are hit by the pandemic basically in a very similar way. We are free, open, democratic, market-oriented societies that have to deal with the crisis in similar ways. In these respects, Germany and the US are more similar than it maybe sometimes looks in public reporting and discussion. I think we are all on a national level, on a local level, struggling and searching for the right reaction, lockdown or not, personal responsibility, local level versus federal level, competitions between states and, in the German case, Länder, each looking for an appropriate reaction to the pandemic, each having different circumstances in their own states or Länder in Germany. So that leads to sometimes different reactions. To make a first point here, I think there is this discussion going on. Are the reactions maybe of some authoritarian regimes better than ours or than the democratic reactions? I really want to make the point that I think the democratic model is stronger and more successful in the long run because it involves people, stabilizes the democratic systems, and autocratic systems might look stronger for the moment, but in the end, they will lose their population and in the end, they will be less successful. For the moment, in the foreseeable future, that is what governments, again, I think very similarly in Germany and the US and other similar countries have to do. First, it is protect the people. That is basically the epidemiological challenge. Then, of course, the second one is to avoid economic, social, and political catastrophe and establish a basis for recovery. The third task is to enable free movement of people, not only of goods. And the overall task is to safeguard democracy and freedom under these difficult circumstances. So the question that always comes up, I mean, how strong are the changes that the pandemic brings about? And you, Matthew, have also mentioned a few things that might actually lead to chances that come up in the fighting of this crisis. So the question that I want to just highlight a little bit, has Corona changed everything? And I personally always like to put things into a bigger context, and I think that 4 questions come up. The first three ones I will not deal with here today, but I would just like to mention them as an introduction. The first one is a really fundamental question on a personal level. What has the pandemic changed for us? Psychologists know it's very difficult to change yourself, to change behavior, and so on. Many people have been locked in. Many questions have been raised. What does that do to our personal experience? I might be a bit older than a couple of you, and my dominating experience basically in my personal history was the fall of the wall that I lived through very much. I suppose for many people, it will be now the lockdown of the coronavirus, which will have a lasting influence on them. The second level of reactions would be the question of domestic policies. And there again, each country has to find its answers. Each the political parties of the countries have to find solutions for that. So what does that mean for employment, for the healthcare system, for security, for the polarization within political parties or within societies? That is a matter of domestic policies, and obviously these reactions are different in the US or in Germany or in other European countries. The third level is a very broad range. That is the changes in international global policies, and I will come back to that later. And that leads to the fourth level, in my view, that is, what does it actually mean for the transatlantic relations? Coming to the point that we want to discuss a little bit. So I like to put the changes that we are talking about on an international level in the context of, I've mentioned already that I started in the 89-90 sort of major experience. And since then, we had quite a few changes and developments going on. To be very brief here, in this context, the sort of mega trends of the 1990s were simply the decade of hope, a new world order and prosperity. That was a starting point for fundamental changes, German European unification, and of course, on an economic level, we had the start of an unprecedented globalization and liberalization of world trade that led to very many positive developments, of course. And this first decade was then cut short, or had a brutal awakening, of course, in the 9/11. That was basically the second decade since then, with Islamist terrorism and culminating in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't want to go deeper into that. Then the 2010s, the decade that we are basically just leaving, was when I noted this down, I find quite an amazing decade of a variety of different crises. So as if it wasn't enough that the old decade ended with war still going on, there was the financial crisis, which of course started in 2008 and 9, but dominated the decade of the years 10 and following. It led to, in Europe, to the sovereign debt crisis, financial crisis, and even what at the time was called the Euro crisis. And it strained very much the European solidarity, led to massive disputes with Germany in particular. And I don't know exactly, but you might be too young, but at the time, really, I mean, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain were in severe difficulties. So it was really a severe crisis within the European Union. And on top of that, then came in 2015, the migration crisis that hit the EU very hard, in particular, of course, migration being a global problem, as you very well know in this country. But for Europe, it was the 2015 migration crisis, basically caused by the war in Syria, which, by the way, was a very sad and moral disgrace for our part of the world. And then, of course, overlaid by another crisis that was the Brexit referendum, which was a mixture of an unresolved migration crisis, institutional problems in the EU, and an ongoing identity crisis in Great Britain. So this was quite a lot for Europe, but of course it had global effects. And as if that wasn't enough, this decade was also characterized by a rise of populism, crisis of democracy, authoritarian regimes, polarization of societies, and then a starting crisis of journalism, and basically endangered freedoms and liberties in quite a number of places. So that actually, when you look at it all together, it's quite an amount of crisis movements. At the same time, however, I want to point that out, and I hope I can make the point why I'm dealing with this decade in particular. There is also a very positive side of the decade of 2010 following, which basically started in 2007, but was delayed a bit by the financial crisis. When you look at, somebody put this together, and that's really interesting, the year 2007 was the starting point of amazing technological revolutions. Of course, what the main event maybe in that year was the year 2007 when the smartphone was launched, a market that was before dominated by Nokia, Motorola, Sony, BlackBerry, companies which have basically disappeared today. And then at the same time, 2007, Facebook and Twitter really took off. Hadoop is a software to operate large data. The Amazon Kindle was launched and Airbnb actually was launched. So these are just a few examples of the significance of the year 2007, which started really a period of 10 to 15 years digital transformation. And of course, coming from Germany as a car producing company, 15 years ago, basically we had a car with a small computer, maybe regulating the engine or helping in some other ways. And nowadays you have the impression that it's more like a computer with an engine and wheels. That's how the technological development has even reached the car manufacturing. So there are these positive developments. And again, I'm coming back to mega trends, which are just sort of overlaying the whole, basically our time. Just to briefly mention these keywords: urbanization, digitalization. Basically, we have reached the time of the crisis of globalization, and of course that led to trade disputes, intellectual property, and I even haven't mentioned climate change yet, which is one of the huge challenges we have to deal with. But there is a geopolitical side, which I haven't touched on, and I can only briefly do some kind of name dropping, because in that time, we really have the serious phase of revisionism of Russia, the rise of China, still problems in the Middle East, nuclear threat from Iran and North Korea. I try just to mention all these names and phenomena and developments to see how actually, even in comparison, I think the last decade is really unusually complicated to deal with. And now, of course, we are in the situation that we have to ask ourselves, how can the transatlantic relations contribute to a resolution, or what are the best partnerships basically globally to tackle these problems and maybe find some solutions. And now I would like to briefly touch on the situation of Germany and the EU. I start maybe briefly with Germany. Of course, Germany has had a really good phase in the last 10, 15 years that is closely linked to the chancellorship of Angela Merkel. She's been very successful and a very good chancellor, but of course it is already known that she will not run again for office. So basically that means that beginning of next year, basically there will be elections. So the era of Chancellor Merkel is coming to an end. And that means that in 2021, we'll have a new chancellor and maybe a new coalition, maybe, and new priorities and so on. So there are changes going on in Germany, and they will be, of course, substantial. We are still now touching briefly on the European Union. Germany holds the presidency now in the last half year. I don't know whether you are all familiar with the functioning of the European Union. The presidency generally shouldn't be overrated, but of course it is now in this very complicated phase with the challenges that we face with a pandemic this presidency has a special significance. And so you could briefly say that the main goals of the presidency that Germany has now are probably described by the terms recovery. That means economic recovery, making available enough funds to really make this recovery possible. Then there is the challenge of institutional reform. I've mentioned already that Britain is leaving. We don't exactly know yet what the Brexit will look like, but it will definitely happen. That means we need new institutional forms and reforms in the European Union. And as it happens, the European Union makes a budget actually for 7 years each time. And we are just about in the process of making the new budget for 7 years. And with Britain having left, that means as a very, of course, people sometimes forget that Britain is the fourth largest economy in Europe and in the European Union. And of course, Britain, despite of all the Thatcher rebates, Britain made a very substantial contribution to the European Union. And as Britain is now leaving, this will have financial consequences for all other members. And I think in particular, Germany will have to pay more to the EU budget. And so this is, nobody likes to pay more. So this will be some kind of debate within Germany. And of course, to get the budget together will be some kind of negotiating process within the European Union. So that is recovery, reform, as I've mentioned, and it has been described as a third task is reunification of Europe, because the relations have been strained in the pandemic. The original reaction has been more according to national lines in the European Union. So we didn't come really to a crisis in the sense that we have in the debt situation, financial crisis in 2008 and 9. And I also think the divisions were not as deep as in the migration crisis, but still there are sort of different camps in the European Union. They are sometimes described, although I don't think it's fair, but sometimes described as the frugal North against the spending South. And then, of course, you have the East and the West. And this is something with maybe different approaches to a couple of political questions. So this is actually a great task to reunite and make really the EU a significant partner again. And I will leave it at that. And I will just make a final point on the transatlantic cooperation. In these kind of circumstances, and obviously we are standing at the beginning of the next decade. I've mentioned the new government, a new chancellor that we will have next year. And it's maybe very difficult to, or maybe not difficult, but anyway, it's difficult to predict who will be the next presidency. But one thing is for sure, even in the US, there will be a new presidency. And each presidency, obviously, whoever the president is, will have a different kind of aims and political goals. And but still, in a wider sense, the challenges will be basically the same or very similar, whoever will be the president. So there will be still the kind of globalization thing. There will still be the question of jobs losses. There will still be the question, not to talk about the geopolitical ones, like there will still be the Iran problem, the North Korea problem, the Russia problem, and how to deal with China will be a big thing, and that will be basically on the agenda for the next decade coming. And for this decade, that's the point I want to make. I think that's really clearly a position also that the German government is holding, that the transatlantic relations are the backbone of our free and democratic global order. in Germany or Europe, it's more often sometimes also called multilateral order, but basically that is a global order. We have shared values, democratic governance, rule of law, and deep economic ties. The trade volume in the transatlantic field is about $3 trillion, and that is just a very brief expression of that. And the trusted scientific research, we see that now in the attempt to find a vaccination against the coronavirus. Major research is done in the US, of course, and in Europe to find the right vaccination for that. The question, of course, you might say, well, don't we have disputes? Yes, we have disputes, certainly a lot. But I really think, although maybe it sounds strange to you, but I really think that there are disputes on the surface, but the fundamentals are still very similar. Disputes makes the headlines, and governments have their agendas, their elections going on in every country. They are each, there's an old saying, so that each government has its own domestic problems and agenda. But for that, we have elections to consult the voters. Germany will have elections next year in 2021, and you will have elections even before. And I would just also mention the sort of old-fashioned iceberg metaphor that you only see 1/7, but that's the 1/7 that you see might be the problems, but what is under the surface are really the common values and interest. We might agree on strategies and tactics to get there, and it is the role of diplomats in that respect, also of the embassy in Washington, to make these disagreements constructive and transform them into solutions. We follow here the policy of engage, 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 even in fields where it does not look easy at the beginning. Like, of course, we have questions with China, with trade, with international taxation, with environment. Then there is the digitization. We have security, data privacy, and so on. And here again, there is my fundamental point. I think that we would rather find solutions with the US than with any other partner. So even if it sounds daring maybe to you, I really think that the 2020s will be a transatlantic decade. American leadership is needed. And in Germany, of course, we have the debate. Sometimes some people don't like the American president. The former president of the American AICGS abbreviation wrote an article that actually Germans, I mean, most of the American presidents are not really liked in Germany, maybe in other parts too. So this is something we have to deal with anyway, because the problems are there apart from the persons. And Germany and maybe France bring the major force to this strong Europe. And I really think that Germany is in the center of this transatlantic cooperation. And we have, I think, a mutual interest in being successful that is sometimes forgotten. Actually, the European Union wants to be stronger, and I think it would be a misunderstanding to think that the US would the EU like the EU not to be stronger. I think it's in the real interest for the US to have a strong European Union, and the other way around. I think it's also in our serious interest to have a strong United States. That's in the interest of Germany and the European Union. And I found one passage that I would like to finish with that is from a speech of Chancellor Merkel. She maybe doesn't give as many speeches as the French president, but that's why I sometimes think it's even more interesting maybe to read exactly what she says. And there's two little passages that I have translated, and because I think they're really important. They represent her position, but they also, I'm sure, they represent the position of the next government for the next decade. And so that is what Chancellor Merkel said on May 27th, so just a few weeks ago. I quote, "Europe's most important partner are the United States. I'm aware of the fact that the cooperation is at the moment more complicated than we would wish. That is true for climate and trade policy or the role of international organizations in the fight against the corona pandemic. Nevertheless," she says, "I'm deeply convinced that the transatlantic relations, our cooperation and the alliance with the US within NATO are and will remain a central pillar of our, that is German, foreign and security policy. It is in our fundamental national and European interest not only to safeguard this pillar, but to strengthen it." And then there is a second passage which actually just follows, and that is also addresses a little bit the fact that sometimes the question is asked, where does Germany stand between China and the US? Should Germany have to make up its mind and so on? And there she just states, I quote, "We should never forget that Europe is not neutral. Europe is a part of the political West. If Europe wants to stand her ground, we want to and we have to, then we have to take things into our own hands and more than in the past act as a reliable partner in the Western community of shared values and interests." So that was a bit, yeah, actually it was much longer than I thought. I'm sorry for that. I spoke probably slower than I should have, but anyway, I hope you have some interesting insights, and I'm looking forward to a couple of questions, of course.
Thank you so much, Mr. Klause. That was a wonderful, wonderful overview for us and a great entry point into the conversation. I will invite our audience to drop any questions that they might have into the Q&A feature. To get us started, I think it might help to start at the very local level. Many Americans, as is happening around the world right now, are saying to themselves, what is the new normal? What do we need to be doing to fight COVID? We've seen the curves that are happening in different countries. Germany's curve peaked, as you know, in late March or early April, and there's been a tremendous flattening since then. In the US, we just had our highest single-day total of the entire pandemic. And so clearly two very different experiences. But I think it would benefit the audience to know, what is the experience of the typical German through this? Were there significant lockdowns? Were there significant restrictions in place? You talked about the balance of individual freedoms and liberties with public health concerns. So I'd appreciate your commenting a little on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the personal experience of every German was that in the middle of March, like everywhere and everybody, we were really afraid. We had the pictures of Italy, which was probably really hit without any kind of warning. And so everything, the healthcare system and so on, was overwhelmed. And that was obviously the situation that Germany also and everybody wanted to avoid. So there was quite a start with a significant lockdown, and people took it really seriously. And I mean, that's more my personal impression now. And I share that actually. I was afraid because we knew very little about the virus, about how it spreads, how easily it spreads, and so on. So there was I think, a very strict adherence to the lockdown wishes, and the responsibility was very high. And together with, I think, with a couple of factors that nobody really can explain, Germany was a bit luckier maybe than other countries. Maybe it has to do a bit with our general reasonably good standard of the health system, of how people stuck to it. But I don't want to bore you with my private life. But my wife is French, so I'm a bit familiar with the French situation too. One of our sons lives in France, and to be quite honest, I think the measures were actually stricter in France than in Germany, because there you really were not allowed to go out, and that was not completely the case. But altogether, Germany was lucky, and now after the first weeks of very severe lockdowns, now each land in Germany is looking for its own path. You might have heard two examples. One is Bavaria, one is North Rhine-Westphalia. And maybe a bit like, I actually, to be honest, I find some of the situation not as totally different from the US as you might think, because North Rhine-Westphalia has 20 million people, 25% of German GDP, a lot of companies, a lot of people, and then of course you have very rural states. And for those states, you can take different measures, but now it's all a bit sort of, it's individualizing, so it's not clear what is happening. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for the moment.
No, I think that's very, very helpful insight. Thank you. Recently, we were in conversation with Jeffrey Gertz from the Brookings Institution, who was talking about the difference between an approach to self-sufficiency and approach to globalization, especially right now. There have been in the US, as I'm sure you've heard, greater calls for self-sufficiency, preparedness, stockpiling of resources for fighting pandemics. What has been the proposed balance between self-sufficiency and globalization in Germany and the larger European Union? Is there a call to domesticate the primary industries, or is there still a heavy reliance, do you think, on the global economy?
Yeah, no, that's you've very well described the challenge really ahead, and I don't think there is a clear-cut answer at the moment. I mean, we've realized that, but this is, in that sense, in my personal view, is that the coronavirus pandemic is in many cases actually an accelerator of things that were going on anyway. I don't want to minimize it, but it's an acceleration, and we've realized that the supply chains, they've in the case of car productions, I mean, there are parts going around the world being shipped to produce something. They were a victim then of tariff restrictions and so on. So I think companies have realized that maybe they have to rethink their supply chains. And I think governments also realized, and to be fair, also the German government realized, I mean, to be quite frank, we didn't have enough sort of protective gear, masks and so on at the beginning of the crisis, and that is not an ideal situation. So I'm sure that some of the emergency planning, nobody likes emergency plannings because it's spending money on something you hopefully never use. So that's not really, nobody wants to pay that, and no politician wants to do that. But I think there's definitely a kind of rethinking, stockpiling in a simple sense, and of course creating production possibilities for certain absolutely essential materials. And then there is the bigger question, of course, but this is not only corona related, it has to do with a strategic independence of certain industrial sectors. And so what about, for example, even for, let's say, I don't know, for smartphone production, where do the components come from? Could we produce them ourselves, and so on? So I think there is a rethinking going on, especially in former times. It's an ugly word, but in former times you would have called it protectionism. And but of course we are all rethinking, and actually that's the point that I'm trying to make it with my possibilities, that we should actually have a dialogue between the US and Germany and Europe on strategic independence, instead of closing ourselves off and trying to become independent on our own, and then with possible negative consequences. Yeah, that's definitely, it's a trend that's simply going on, and it's strengthened by one last aspect of that is, of course, also to protect your own industries. That means against takeovers by foreign companies or governments. So are some companies so important? It's also a question of intellectual property, that you don't really want them to be taken over by foreign companies, or yeah, all these kind of questions.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience around what Americans you think misunderstand about the transatlantic trade relationship. And speaking particularly to the audience here in Kansas City, why would you say that the trade, especially transatlantic trade, is important?
Well, I mean, that's really going to the fundamentals of our economic system. And of course, there is a big debate going on. The system we have, I'm coming to trade in a second, the German system is called social market economy. The American system in that sense is called market economy. And the word, of course, that everybody uses very often is capitalism. But capitalism really is a sort of, oh, I just switched off one of my lamps by mistake, but you can still see me. Capitalism, of course, is a political word like socialism, and you really have to ask what you mean by that. And in that sense, the basic idea of our economic system is that you exchange goods for the advantage of both partners of the trade. I mean, that's the essential, basically, even in diplomacy, foreign policy, whatever, that you have a win-win situation. It's not a zero sum. That's a fundamental difference, and many misunderstand that in whatever context, you know, that there is the idea, if you win something, that necessarily somebody else has to lose. And really the beauty, I think, of the sort of market system that has been established in the last 200-300 years is that actually both win by exchanging things, and that is the same with trade. So it's not on the marketplace, but it's basically international trade. But it's obvious that with trade you can get better goods, you can get cheaper goods, and but of course trade is in a context. So if one partner, and I think that is the discussion going on here, if one partner thinks like in the US, well, we've lost all our jobs and they all went to China, so we don't want to trade that anymore with them anymore, that is probably not a solution in the long run, because all experience that we have shows that trading actually makes products and markets better, and is an advantage for consumers, because in the end consumers get a better product. So how to organize the trade that is fair, and I think that are the key terms, fair and reciprocal, that is something that has to be readjusted basically all the time. That is that's why, in a sense, I think we can say we don't have a free market and we don't have free trade in that, because we have rule-based trade. We want to establish a set of rules that ideally we stick to in our trade relations.
There have been quite a number of news stories over the last few days about a few potential upcoming changes to the US-European relationship. We've heard about US military presence in Germany possibly shifting. And then just this week, and this is a question from the audience, we've heard about the EU considering blocking US travelers due to COVID-19. That is, of course, a step that the US took several months ago to block travelers coming from Europe into the United States. Do you have a prediction on where some of these things would go, or do you have comments that you'd like to share around them?
Well, I think that really I'm a great fan who believes in interests. You know, that you have to. The key word is really mutual advantage. You know, we have to make a point, and the US have to make a point that it's in the advantage of the partner to change certain rules, and we think it's. Take the military presence in Germany in particular. I think everybody knows that it is a very important hub for the US. There is a huge, one of the major hospitals for all the US operations in the Middle East and Africa. Usually wounded soldiers and so on are flown to Germany first and then so on. So the presence in Germany has a great significant role. Do we need the presence on the level we had so far? Are the troops, the nature of the troops changing? Troops nowadays have to be much more mobile. You know, this has to be, we have to make a point that it is in the interest of the US to keep the troops in Germany. And that's, I believe that there is, anyway, that's the way how governments can deal with each other. We have to make clear what the interest is. And the same is true for trade. For example, what you mentioned, I mean, we have to make a point, and I think we can make the point that it's in the interest of the US to have a valuable trading partner in the EU for the reasons I mentioned, and also going one step further, if and I think we agree in many aspects that there has been abuse from the Chinese side for intellectual property and some other trade practices, market entry, and so on. So I think we have a very good point telling our US partners, look, if you want to do something in these matters, then Europe is a very good partner for that. You know? And then also you have to sort of build alliances, and you cannot, if you want to be in a partnership, an alliance, you cannot annoy your partner on one field all the time and then cooperate on the following day. So it's, I'm really convinced that the EU and Germany are really good partners for many of the aims and the goals the US wants to achieve. But we have to make a point, and interests shift. And as I've tried to make a point, I mean, we have so many different challenges at the same time at the moment.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Let's turn for a minute to global leadership. Chancellor Merkel recently said how Europe fares in this crisis compared to other regions of the world will determine both the future of European prosperity and Europe's role in the world. As you mentioned, a major goal for the EU right now is the reunification of Europe. Brexit is moving forward. Individual countries are confronting their own range of individual domestic challenges, including keeping COVID at bay. What do you imagine the future of European leadership looks like, and what role does Germany play in that future?
A very interesting point, of course, and the European Union is not the United States. And so there will not be some kind of coherent leadership as you might expect from the United States. And it is a technical term, but personally, I've always been a fan of the US global hegemony. Some people find that not very attractive. Maybe if you are not, to be very realistic about it, maybe if people are not over enthusiastic about the US as a global hegemon, I think you should look at the alternatives. Yeah? And so that is, even if there are no other reasons, I think there is a compelling case for a strong leadership role of the US if you look at the alternatives. Europe will always be in a different leadership role. And we are not sort of, Europe is not in the position to lead in the same way. But Europe is globally a very important partner, economically a big market and so on. So it can be very influential. And I suppose it's the best way when the European Union and the US put their strengths together. Germany, for you or others who know roughly the situation of Germany, I think Germany has found an ideal place within the European Union because it has been famously said Germany as such is too big for Europe and too small for the world. And that I think is totally true. And Germany has benefited enormously from being integrated in the European Union. And I think, as I quoted the Chancellor, in that sense, it's really in the German national interest to have a strong European Union.
Last fall, we had a colleague of yours from a career foreign service officer from Germany, Stefan Schluter, whom you may know, and was with us talking about populism on the rise around the world, and offering a really interesting perspective from Germany on what the rise of populism indicates. We know that COVID has aggravated some of those populist tendencies and responses. What would you say that level leadership looks like in the midst of particularly this crisis, which is multifaceted, as you outlined so well, from a public health standpoint, an economic standpoint, just a social well-being standpoint? What does level leadership looks like that cools that populist trend and allows a stable approach to solving collective issues?
Yeah, that's a interesting and very good question, and but the answer is maybe a little bit complicated. To start with I know roughly the debates about it, and I sometimes it's always difficult to be ironic, especially on video and so on, but I start with a slightly ironic remark that is sometimes I find that the argument of populism is used in particular if somebody is in power of a party that you don't like. So a populist is always the other. The other person or the other group, the other party is populist. But on a more serious note, actually what has been interesting, and that's probably a very interesting sociological or whatever explanation. Before the crisis, Chancellor Merkel was basically not that popular anymore. It was a bit, what you call in the US system a sort of lame duck. Everybody knew she would go. And her party was also not that popular, having sort of like 25%, so basically nearly on the same level as the Green Party and so on. So now, funnily enough, what happened in the crisis, obviously Chancellor Merkel has proved one more time what a great leader she is, calm and so on. And now she stands with some of her highest percentages ever, and her party is at sometimes 40%, which is basically unbelievable in a German context. So in a sense, the crisis and the sort of leadership that she has shown in the crisis has been a very effective way of sort of minimizing populism. So I see the point, I see the argument. Obviously, it's too short now to discuss that in full detail, and that is but it's an interesting fact that in fact the right-wing party in Germany has really lost support, and that the center parties have gained strength again. And the Grand Coalition, so the coalition of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, the party of the Chancellor, have really gained support again. And the really, I would say, lucky, happy, whatever you call it, situation for Germany is that as these parties, they don't like it, but the two big parties are locked in a grand coalition. So they're really forced to compromise. So that also means that in these very tough measures, they can't oppose each other, which would further polarize the situation. Like you have in other countries. I don't want to comment here what is going on, but there is no way that, as maybe in a heated political debate, you tend to blame the other party for whatever happened. And this is not possible in Germany, lucky us in that sense, but it also shows, and that's my point really, that an effective way of dealing with populism is good results in political, in actually governance, good governance. Good governance is a good measure against populism.
Thank you. And as we come to the end of our time, I wonder if you might like to leave us on a very hopeful note. Do you have a specific example of international cooperation in the midst of COVID, whether it's around vaccine development or health data, supplies and equipment, pharmaceuticals, that you have found very compelling and you think bodes well for the relationship you're talking about?
Well, to be, yes, but as I've tried to make as a point, I think we'll come into a transatlantic decade, or it might seem a little bit unlikely. I'm totally optimistic. I'm optimistic that the market economy, the market system, of course, we have to deal on the bad effects, on the negative social effects of the market economy / capitalism, that's for sure. But I'm basically very optimistic that, we've gone through a crisis of 3 months, and there was never really a serious shortage of goods, of whatever it was. Nobody starved, nobody. And that is, in my view, that is a result of the fast reacting market mechanism. And and also the democracy in that sense. We will have decisions, democratic decisions of how the voters liked the management by the government. So, and then of course, I'm totally optimistic what the innovation and innovation combined with sort of respect for privacy, data privacy, personality, even in the field of environmental, there seems to be such a wide division between our in the transatlantic relations, but I think there will be many aspects from both sides of the Atlantic how to really face the environmental challenges we have. And last one, of course, that if once the coronavirus sort of vaccination or medicaments are developed, and I don't want to say it in any way referring to any other country, but I would be very happy to use and vaccinations and medicaments that were developed in the US or Germany, when I look at the testing and the reliability of what is going on. So, I don't know, maybe it's maybe I'm naturally too optimistic, but I'm extremely optimistic.
Karl Matthias Klause, head of the economic section of the German embassy in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Again, we thank our program partners, the World Trade Center Kansas City and the Bertelsmann Foundation. This has been Matthew Hughes from the International Relations Council in Kansas City. Please have a good day.